Hello to everyone in the Hill Life Group. We will continue our study of the book of Psalm today. Specifically, we're going to be in Psalm chapter 95, and we will cover verses 1 through 11, which is the entire chapter. So Psalm 95 is actually a call to worship God, and it lays out a case of why we should worship Him. God actually inspires the psalmist to abruptly interrupt the hymn, specifically at the latter part of verse 7, this hymn of praise, and warn people to be faithful to Him. But one of the things I want us to remember as we're going through the study of Psalm 95 is that our lives should demonstrate our worship of Him through obedience. So I want us to kind of think about this. We're going to dive into that and dissect that a little bit further, that sentence a little bit further. So let's go ahead and start with chapter 95, verse 1 and 2. Come, let us shout joyfully to the Lord, shout triumphantly to the rock of our salvation. Let us enter His presence with thanksgiving. Let us shout triumphantly to Him in song. So first, the psalmist invites people to step forward before the God of worship, and there's two plural pronouns in this. The initial one is in verse 1. It says, "Come, let us shout joyfully." The second one is the first portion of verse 2. Let us enter His presence. This isn't a singular mindset. This is a plural mindset. This is more of like corporate worship, and the psalmist starts out with what is similar to a call of worship as our service begins. And the psalmist calls people into worship using two parallel words that mean shout. Shout joyfully, shout triumphantly. The first word is in a form that is used in the Old Testament to refer to joyful shouting, and some translations actually render that sing here. The second word, translated shout triumphantly, occurs in the Old Testament and refers to shouting in numerous situations. So this is a joyful, this is a triumphant shouting, this is a very positive mindset, and it says we're supposed to shout triumphantly to whom? To the rock of our salvation. So when we as a congregation, when we are in a congregation, it's easy for us to focus either on people around us, people on stage, or even ourselves, but worship is first and foremost to the rock of our salvation. It's first and foremost about God. We are in His presence. Our praising, our mindset, our praying should all be directed towards Him. He should be that core. He should be the center of our attention in worship. And in verse 2, let us enter His presence. The phrase enter His presence translates two words in the original Hebrew. The first word refers to meeting or confronting someone, while the second word literally means His face. So kind of hence the phrase refers to appearing directly in the presence of God. We're presenting ourselves before Him. And the psalmist actually directs us how we should present ourselves before Him, and it's with thanksgiving. And too often people, and I'm even guilty of it too, sometimes attempt to enter His presence with personal requests or complaints that they want God to resolve. But just think about when God hears from you, and when He does hear from you, are you thankful? Do you come with a thankful heart for everything that He's already done? Yes, corporate worship should include expressing love and encouragement to other believers, but don't kind of deviate from the central point. The central person of worship remains God. So we should always make Him the center of our thoughts and actions while we're worshiping. Verses 3 through 5. For the Lord is a great God, a great King above all gods. The depths of the earth are in His hand, and the mountain peaks are His. The sea is His, He made it, and His hands formed the dry land. That first part, for the Lord is a great God. If we kind of stop there, someone could easily possibly understand that to mean that God is just one God a great God among many great gods. But the psalmist actually clarifies this. He's a great king above all gods. And we all know that false gods, they do exist in the minds of idolatrous people, but the one true God is the king above every conception of deity that exists, and he is our sovereign ruler of our universe. Verse 4, the depths of the earth are his. If we go all the way down, God formed the center of the earth. They're vast, they're inaccessible to us, but even the deadly core that's approximately 1,500 miles in diameter and can get as hot as 10,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It's like a pebble in his hand. And he moves from the center of the earth all the way up to the mountain peaks, which, there are times that we can even barely climb them, and it's only in specific times of the year that we can even remotely access them. Verse 5, the sea is his, he made it, and his hands formed the dry land. So God created everything that is wet and everything that is dry, just as in verse 4 affirms that God is sovereign over everything that is low and everything that is high. When someone creates a work of art, it truly belongs to them. When someone invents a brand new product and develops that product, if they're smart, they hold the patent to it. Verse 5, God is affirming that he created the universe and he himself owns it. Let's continue to read down 6 through the first part of verse 7. Come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker, for he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture, the sheep under his care. Okay, so the psalmist repeats his invitation to worship in verse 6, just as he did in verse 1, but the mindset, the mood is very, very different. The first verb is translated worship, and its basic meaning is to prostrate oneself, whereas in verse 1 and 2, we were talking about shouting joyfully and shouting triumphantly. So although it seems like a much more joyous and happy occasion in the initial 2 verses, verse 6 is a little bit more meditative. We're to humble ourselves before God in recognition that he's holy and he's awesome, and we just aren't. It's not to say that you can't have both attributes into worship. Worship can be both celebrative, like it was in verse 1 and 2, but also meditative, as in verse 6. And verse 7 shows us why we should show reverence to him. The Lord is our God, and we are the people of his pasture, the sheep under his care. The relationship between a shepherd and a sheep is very commonplace in the Bible, and its relationship between God and his people, just as in Psalm 23:1, the Lord is my shepherd, there is nothing that I lack, for truly seeking after him. So that first portion of what we studied there, verses 1 through the first part of verse 7 of Psalm 95 is solely about worship, but now we kind of get into that warning that we had discussed there at the initial portion of the podcast. So let's continue on reading verses 7 kind of B through 11. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as at Meribah, as on that day at Massah in the wilderness, where your fathers tested me. They tried me, though they had seen what I did. For 40 years I was disgusted with that generation. I said, they are a people whose hearts go astray. They do not know my ways. So I swore in my anger, they will not enter my rest. Okay, so the tone changes drastically at the end of verse 7. The psalmist issues an urgent warning after inviting people to worship God because of his greatness. It says, do not harden your hearts. This is something that is hardened, is not soft or pliable, flexible, or malleable. It's very stiff and just not ductile at all. But hearing the Word of God, obeying it, and applying it to our lives, it just makes us moldable in God's hands. The remainder part of verse 8 actually alludes to Israel's experience at Meribah and Massah. So if we kind of look at those initially, Meribah comes from the root word meaning to test, while Massah comes from the root word meaning to test. Meribah comes from the root word meaning to complain. So to test, to complain. So it kind of comes back to a point where the Israelites had hardened their hearts when they complained to God and Moses about their lack of water. So just prior to that, in Egypt, Pharaoh had repeatedly hardened his heart against God, but in response, God sent 10 plagues and delivered the Hebrews from slavery, but also displayed his power. So after God liberated them, instead of trusting God and to continue to provide for them in every aspect of their lives, they complained about their lack of food and water while they're wandering in the wilderness. And as we pick it up in verse 10, this is what God had thought about them. He was disgusted with that generation. Rest for the Hebrews was entry into the promised land. It was directly by means of the conquest of Canaan, but as we know, they did not enter the promised land due to their sin, and it was really only Joshua and Caleb who had believed in God to enter that rest. But as we know when we studied the book of Hebrews, the type of rest that they desire there, and the rest that we desire, primarily the rest that we desire, we can find a relationship with God based on worship and trust, and this style of a relationship is possible, and it's possible in one way, and that's through a relationship with Jesus Christ. So as you go throughout the remainder of your week, just think about this Psalm 95 of worship, and how we're supposed to shout joyfully and triumphantly, but also humble ourselves, as we noticed in verse 6, and bow down. And lastly, don't forget to heed to his warning about not hardening our hearts. Always kind of be open to his thoughts, and we can know those thoughts by continually having a relationship with Jesus Christ. Hope everybody has a great week.